Greetings hobbyists, this is All, and in this video we're going to have a look at how to do inset panels like a pro. Now before we get into the main focus of this video, which is using the native tools in Blender to be able to do this, I do want to point out that you can make inserts very easily using Boxcutter, which generally comes with hard ops. Now this is a paid for add-on, you can see what I'm doing with that here on the screen, and it is very quick and easy to use, but as I said, it is paid for and not everyone wants that. If you do want to have a look at some more videos on hard ops and Boxcutter, especially focusing on Boxcutter, I've got a link coming up in the top right hand corner, and it's also in the description for a playlist on how to use Boxcutter to do a range of things, not just these sort of insets. But it should be said, with some really complex objects, sometimes Boxcutter does have some difficulties, especially with this inset option, which is one of the ones that is more likely to have errors. So without further ado, let's get on to doing this without using Boxcutter, just using the tools native to Blender. So let's look at something without that, and we're actually going to make this slightly more complex to just show some points that we want to be aware of. So I'm just going to make a cube. I'm going to press S to scale and then Shift and Z so that it only scales on the Z axis, and then scale one more time on the Y axis, somewhere there-ish, just to make something that's going to be, let's say, a wing of a plane. Let's go into face mode, Control and R to put an edge loop somewhere there, and then let's grab this face and then let's just scale that in the Z axis, because that's apparently as streamlined as a wing needs to be in a sci-fi universe, and that's about as streamlined as my shoe, but whatever, who cares? Aerodynamics doesn't matter in the future, that's sci-fi. Now let's just start having a look at how we would make this inset if we didn't have something like Boxcutter. So I'm just going to Shift and A and apply the scale so we don't get any weird actions here, and I'm just going to bring in a new cube. That's going to be what my cut is going to be. So Shift and A, mesh, and I'm going to bring in a cube, bring it to there, let's S to scale it up so I've got something a bit of a decent size. I'm going to move it, I don't know, there, and let's see what shape we're going to get. Let's vertex these, scale those out so we've got something a little bit interesting there, and let's say we're going to cut this out and we want to make an inset. So there's a few ways of doing this, but the most basic one is we're going to cut this out. So I'm going to select that, Shift select that, Control and minus. That is using Ball Tool, which is an add-on that's native to Blender. You can just go to Edit and Add-ons to get that. And obviously this cuts all the way through and we want to leave something in the middle. So how are we going to do that? Right, well, let's undo that. Let's hide this cube for a second. And what we need to do is duplicate this. So I'm going to press Shift and D to duplicate it, escape, and then I'm just going to press S and I can scale that in. And if we go into side view, we can see how that is. So S, and we're scaling that in. Now you'll notice we've instantly got some problems, even though if we click on this and press N, we've got this scale at 1. This still is going to have this funky result because it's different sizes on different axes. So we're going to have to press something like S and then X to scale it out in the X axis to make it a little bit more equal. But we can deal with that, that's fine. So we've now got that inside. I'm just going to press F2 and call this internal, just so it's easier to find. Shift and Z so that we can see what we're doing, and let's bring back our cube and then Control and minus, and you can see we've got our inset. Really easy, and all we're going to do here is then click on this, click there, Control and plus, and then we can see that that's having this sort of slight face fighting. If I just press H to hide that, we've got that done. So that's the easy way of doing it, and it generally works. Now I would say just a first pro tip is don't actually, just to save yourself some time, don't add this to this cube, because you're probably going to make some problems at some point. This would be fine, but it's going to get a little bit complicated later on. So actually you're much better instead taking this, shift selecting your cutter and pressing Control and minus and cutting it out of that. And what that allows you to do is now we just need to H to hide this and H to hide this, and it's working. And you'll generally find this causes less problems. So that's my first pro tip. Generally cut the cutter, don't add it to the object that you're trying to add this inset to. So that works great, except, well, we've already sort of demonstrated some of the problems with this, and that is that as you scale this, it's a bit of a pain. It doesn't scale very nicely. If I wanted to do it more, you'll see it scaling much more on the X than it is on the Z, because scaling is done as a proportion. So you'll notice it's being done in comparison to 1, so at the moment it is at 79.2%. So that doesn't quite work. Also, now I've affected the scale because I did things on the different axes. It's a bit of a pain. Also, if you, for some reason, let's just isolate this and let's go into face mode, select that, Shift and S, and then put the origin to that face. Now if I scale it, you'll notice it's scaling towards that origin. So it's very origin controlled, which actually isn't too bad in this instance. It's actually giving a slightly better result, but it causes problems. I mean, you can do things with this which is quite nice. So for example, you could put your origin on this line to the loop cut when it was here, which means you've got more control and you're going to get less of those problems, but either way it's not great. So actually I'm going to delete that internal object and we're going to have a look at a better way of doing this. So let's just quickly undo this boolean and we'll start afresh. And we're also going to make something a bit more complicated, and I'll demonstrate another problem. So let's do something funky. Let's decide that we actually want to have this more extreme shape. So I'm going to go something like there, and then let's shift and D, and then go to there, and then G and Y, and let's cut both of these from our object. So Control and minus. And that's going to be our shape. So I'm going to hide that, and then I'm going to apply these. So apply all there. There's a link in the top right hand corner if you don't have apply all, and it'll show you how to get that and why it's quite useful to have. So now we're going to do our panel cuts here. And now that this shape is more complex, this is going to cause even more problems. So let's Shift A, let's bring in our cube, scale it up a bit. Let's go, I don't know, there. Let's go there. Something like that. Or maybe even actually on this edge. Let's see how this looks. Now, this is going to cause even more problems if we start scaling this. Again, I'm just going to hide that cube. For now, we're going to Shift and D, and then if I press S and start scaling this, I mean, instantly you can see the problem here. Look, we're getting this overlap, and that's going to cause a load of problems. So this scaling doesn't work. Instead, what we're vastly better off using is if I Shift and D and go into face mode and A to select everything, is we want to use this tool down here, the shrink and fatten tool. Now we can do that down here, but there is a shortcut for it, and that is Alt S. So let's have a look at what this does in comparison to the shape which is currently over the top of it. Let's go into X-ray mode. So Alt S, and we're going to start shrinking or fattening, and you'll notice straight away this has a bit of a nicer result. It's not perfect, but what's happening here is all of these faces are getting pushed or pulled along their normal direction, which means that we don't get the issue here because it's not moving towards the origin, and it generally just gives a better result. Now do notice up here that this hasn't gone perfectly flat. So there are issue points with this. I mean, it's quite easy to solve. You can just grab those vertices and then just press S, Y, and 0, and that will straighten it out. But I do want to emphasize that this isn't perfect. You'll notice the same down here as well. But it is definitely better than just scaling it. Now if I just go back again and do that one more time, you'll also notice, if you look in the top left hand corner, that this movement now, instead of being a proportion to 1, so effectively a percentage, with 1 being 100%, this is actually now doing it in millimeters as well, or whatever your Blender units are, which gives you much more control over the thickness of your inset. For example, if I want it to be, let's say, I don't know, 0.8 millimeters, I could type minus 0.8, and we've got that being perfectly minus 0.8 on these axes. Again, with some slight errors where you've got these cuts there because it's getting confused by the normal direction. But we're not going to cut there, we're going to cut here, and again, we can solve that. So let's go into object mode. I'm going to F2 and call that internal 2, and hopefully you can always guess what this is going to do. So there, Control and minus, and we've got this much nicer inset there. And if we need to, we can always come into this, go into face mode, A to select everything, Alt and S, and we can just scale this up so we can control that size. And we get a very nice looking panel cut where we know the dimensions of what's happened here. So makes for a much nicer design. You'll also notice, which is really funky if I come into top view, that this line of where we've got that is much closer to staying put. It has moved a little bit, but not by much. Again, because it's not being scaled towards the origin. And then as again before, if we want to do this well, we should not just be leaving that there and booleaning it. What we're going to do is Control and minus and cut that out of the cutter. And if we wanted to do more of those, for example, if I Shift and D and go in the Y direction, let's say put another one there. Let's just scale that slightly on the Y and maybe slightly on the X. We can do exactly the same thing again. So there, Control and minus, and then we've got that. And because we duplicated that from this original, it's still got the boolean of the internal cutter going on, so we don't have to do that again. The other thing we can do if we are being lazy, though I will say this gives us slightly less control, is that if you tabbed and go into vertex mode and then shift an A and bring in something, let's say like another cube, and G that to, let's say, there, and do something like that, because this is still part of this object, we get that very, very quickly doing exactly the same thing. Let's hide that and hide that, so you can see what we're doing here and how, let's hide that internal, how this is working out to make this nice series of interesting panel insets. So that is the shrink and fatten tool. Alt and S is the shortcut for it, as opposed to just S, which is scaling, and it moves everything along the normals. Very, very useful when you've got more complex objects where you want to do something like this changing of sizes. If you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, do subscribe for more great content. Have a great day, guys.